Xavier Becerra, United States Secretary of Health and Human Services, testifies before House subcommittee investigating the human trafficking of thousands of missing alien children.
Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Today, the subcommittee meets to conduct oversight into the activities of the Office of Refugee Resettlement administered by the Department of Health and Human Services. We welcome HHS Secretary Xavier Becerra to answer questions that we have arising from his administration of this office. I think we'd all agree that if a child shows up lost and alone on your doorstep, you've got a moral obligation to find out where that child lives and return them safely home. The last thing any decent person would do is to take that child to a stranger's house and leave them there. Yet it appears this is exactly what this administration has been doing for the last 4 years. In just 4 years, this administration has deliberately allowed 7.6 million illegal aliens to enter the United States, releasing more than 5.7 million illegal aliens into the country, while more than 1.9 million known gotaways evaded apprehension, an illegal population larger than the state of Arizona, our 14th largest state. And among them have been an estimated 530,000 unaccompanied alien minors. That's about the entire population of the state of Wyoming. Instead of protecting these children until they could be returned safely home or until their rightful families could be located, HHS deliberately circumvented protocols designed to protect these children and abandoned them to poorly vetted sponsors in the United States. The House Judiciary Committee estimates that roughly 150,000 of these children have now disappeared. They've simply vanished into a dark underworld of sex and drug trafficking, forced labor, gang activity, and crime. Of course, many are not helpless children, but rather teenagers or adults posing as teenagers who themselves present a mortal threat to the public. Take the case of Walter Javier Martinez. He was transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement as an unaccompanied alien child, despite a previous arrest in El Salvador for illicit association with MS-13. One call to Salvadorian authorities would have confirmed this. Maryland authorities later noted that he had gang tattoos. Instead, Martinez was released into our country, no questions asked, and on July 27, 2022, he brutally attacked and killed Kyla Hamilton, who was sound asleep in her own bed. While the prime suspect in her murder, Martinez was placed in a foster home with other children and enrolled in a local high school. He has since admitted to 4 murders, 2 rapes, and additional other crimes. Juan Carlos Garcia Rodriguez from Guatemala, also fast-tracked into our country by this administration as an unaccompanied alien child and released to an unrelated sponsor who was himself an illegal alien. On August 12, 2023, he murdered 11-year-old Maria Gonzalez in her own home, wrapped her body in a trash bag, and stashed it under her bed for her father to find. We don't know how many more such monsters are among the 150,000 unaccompanied alien minors that HHS has lost track of, or how many helpless children have been abducted and exploited. But we are slowly finding out tragedy by preventable tragedy. What we know is that in 2021, Mr. Becerra removed the requirement that ORR provide biographic and biometric data for all adult members of a sponsor's household to check for criminal histories. What could possibly go wrong? Records produced by a whistleblower show that in 2021, HHS disregarded repeated warnings by a case manager about the MS-13 affiliation of one sponsor attempting to take custody of 2 unaccompanied alien children. According to the New York Times, Secretary Becerra berated employees for not processing minors fast enough, saying, quote, "If Henry Ford had seen this in his plant, he would have never become famous and rich. This is not the way you do an assembly line." In July 2021, concerned employees drafted a memo warning that labor, quote, labor trafficking was increasing and complaining that the agency had become, quote, one that rewards individuals for making quick releases and not one that rewards individuals for preventing unsafe releases. According to press reports, Mr. Becerra told then ORR Director Cindy Huang that, and I quote, if she could not increase the number of discharges, he would find someone who could. Huang resigned a month later. Now, the American people have already passed judgment on these policies in the recent election. but those responsible have much to answer for to the victims of their policies and to history. And we welcome the Secretary here today to account for his actions. I'm now pleased to recognize the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Congressman Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So let me get this straight. So a lost child is not actually lost. We just can't find him. 150,000 of them. That's the issue. And that's why we're glad the Secretary is here today to finally answer some of our questions. I do appreciate the Secretary showing up. I had a chance to serve with the Secretary when he was in the Congress. And I appreciate the ranking member. I just disagree with what you had to say. We worked on other issues together, but you know, you can't say, oh, they're not really lost. We just can't contact them. That's the problem. 150,000. And I appreciate the chairman's work and this committee's work. The chairman was the primary driver of H.R. 2 that we passed a year and a half ago that would have solved so many problems with our border and with our immigration system. So I appreciate the work that he's done, and I appreciate this hearing. With that, I yield back.
Mr. Tiffany is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member ripped on the Trump appointees in his opening remarks, which we largely expected. But I just asked the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, do you have a medical degree?
I do not.
You do not have a medical degree. Are you familiar with the Florida grand jury presentment that they did about a year and a half ago in 2023 in regards to unaccompanied alien children?
I'm somewhat familiar with it. I was briefed on it on many occasions.
Are you familiar that in that report, it revealed that children were pimped out by their aunt, which it turns out the aunt wasn't even related to the child, the so-called aunt. Are you familiar with that story that was in there?
There are a number of incidents that are reported in that Florida report. Some of them I can probably recall better than others. Some of them I would challenge and dispute, but that one I don't remember.
And do you remember the teenage girl that was in a house with unknown men with no private bedroom for her? Are you familiar with the sponsors that utilize a strip club in Jacksonville as an address for where this child, where a child should be settled?
Congressman, as I said, I don't have the information on that Florida grand jury report in front of me. I certainly can go back and take a look at it and try to get back to you.
I want to ask you the Harris question. Would you change anything that you've done over the last 4 years in regards to illegal immigration?
Recognizing that we don't deal with immigration, that is part of DHS's authority. We deal with the care, the human services side of care for kids.
Would you change anything that you've done in the last 4 years with 320,000 children unaccounted for by your administration?
We work tirelessly to strengthen and improve the program of the UC, the unaccompanied children that come before us. And we work really hard to make sure we, first and foremost, protect the safety and the well-being of those kids. Every day is a challenge, and we do the best we can.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for appearing before the subcommittee. You mentioned the state of Florida in the context of, I think you characterized it as not being willing to work with HHS. On March 29th, 2023, a Florida grand jury released a report detailing the impact of the UAC influx at the southern border. The grand jury made some of the following conclusions of the Office of Refugee Resettlement, the component agency within HHS entrusted to you, Mr. Secretary. Excerpt, quote, a disturbing pattern has emerged whereby the same sponsor applies to receive multiple UACs, sometimes at the same address, sometimes at a different one. Some individual sponsors apply to receive more than one child at more than one address simultaneously. One address in Texas had 44 children sent to it. Another had 25. One sponsor in Bonita Springs, Florida had multiple children sent to multiple addresses, and he applied using different versions of his hyphenated surname. One address in Austin, Texas, a town which I represent, had more than 100 UAC released to a single family dwelling. Mr. Secretary, is this remotely consistent with the claims by your department that you're doing everything in your power to ensure child security?
Congressman, thank you for the question. All potential sponsors, anyone who wishes to apply to sponsor a child, must undergo extensive vetting process that follows child welfare best practices. We use a variety of tools. We try to monitor as best we can. And recently, through the foundational rule, we have established an even more extensive process for vetting as well.
Do you believe that the HHS foundational rule from April 30th of 2024 is consistent with what you just said in terms of background checks? Is it sufficient?
The foundational rule is what we've built to try to give us a better way to not only care for kids, but also make sure.
Does it
that
require full public
discharges
records
are-
background checks?
I'm sorry?
Does it require full public records background checks and FBI national criminal history checks?
As I said, we follow child welfare best practices when it comes to.
Yes or no, though? Do you do the full criminal history checks for the potential sponsors of these children?
Well, yes, we follow best practices.
Right, the answer is no.
It's a yes, we follow child welfare best practices.
Yeah, that's not my question. My question is, do you do background checks, the full criminal records, public background checks for the FBI national criminal history?
We certainly check for criminal records. We check for sex offender in the sex offender registry. We do, again, the different
rule says you
things
don't.
that the foundation, that.
The rule I'm
child
talking
welfare-
about says you do not.
I'm sorry?
The rule that we're talking about that was released on April 30th, 2024 says you do not.
We do not what?
That you do not carry out FBI national criminal history checks for all potential sponsors.
We do background checks on every individual.
Right, but that's a slippery description. What I'm saying is this rule is pretty clear in what it's saying, that you do not provide the kind of background checks, which, by the way, has created the problems. Let me move on because in the interest of time. Are you familiar with Maria Gonzalez, an 11-year-old girl who lived in Pasadena, Texas? In August 2023, Ms. Gonzalez was allegedly raped and murdered by Juan Carlos Garcia Rodriguez, a Guatemalan national who appealed at the southern border as a UAC in January of 2023 and was 17 years old. A month later, HHS released Garcia Rodriguez to a sponsor with a criminal history and who previously had 2 other UACs in his care, failed to enroll them in school as required by HHS. How about the situation with respect to another individual, Kayla Hamilton? Are you familiar with Walter Javier Martinez? Martinez was a 17-year-old from El Salvador who appeared at the border as a UAC in March of 2022. Months later, in July 22, he raped and murdered Kayla Hamilton, a 20-year-old woman in Maryland. After Martinez's release from the border and before Mrs. Hamilton's tragic death, HHS released him to a sponsor in May of 2022. Despite Martinez having gang tattoos and an arrest record for illicit association with MS-13. Mr. Secretary, how can you credibly claim that HHS is working to protect these children? And by the way, children we're talking about in the order of magnitude of 400 and something thousand children, which you are dismissing that they are lost. Let me ask you a very specific question, Mr. Secretary. Can you account for the whereabouts of those 400 and something thousand children? The 320,000 that were put in the report by the Inspector General, the 85,000 that we've talked about before in 2023. Do you know where all of these children are and that they are safe? Yes or no?
Congressman, as I explained the process, we get these kids when they are referred to us by the Department of Homeland Security. We then provide them with care while they are in our custody. We lose custody of those kids once we find a vetted sponsor with whom they can stay.
A vetted sponsor that rapes and murders the people that they're entrusted to? Because you issue a rule that doesn't even do the background check? That's what you think is appropriate care for these children? I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
We do background checks.
Chair recognizes Mr. Moore.
Hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome. You know, before my time, I understand that this committee had 3 hearings on lost children under the Trump administration. At that time, it was only 1,000 lost children. And if I remember correctly, there was a certain member, and I won't give her name, but her initials are AOC, put on a white suit and went to the border to protest this 1,000 lost children. And now, my friend, the New York Times, actually, this is not a Republican rag, by the way. I reported in February of 2023, HHS had lost over 85,000 unaccompanied children. And my question to you is, as this process continues, I think you're in over your head. I think the administration has buried you. I don't think there's any way you can keep track of what's going on the southern border, and we're losing children by the droves. And when you talk about background checks, how is it that one individual could get 20 children? How does that happen, Mr. Secretary?
Congressman, thanks for the question. Actually, I think I heard 2 questions there. The first is on 85,000 lost kids. Again, not answering a phone call, that does not mean a child is
Secretary, let me tell you something. If my wife calls one of my kids, and on about the second call, we don't know where that child is, it is pandemonium around the Moore household. And I got news for you. When you're losing children to the tune of 85,000, there are parents somewhere in this world, and I don't know where the parents are, that are sending these children here for some reason. And they're being trafficked. They've been used for child labor. And again, this is the New York Times. This is not a Republican talking point. This is not a Republican rag. This is the New York Times talking about the mismanagement of this administration of these children and how we've lost them. And so my question to you is, how does one sponsor get 20 children? If we're background checking, in fact, how does that happen?
Congressman, every sponsor must go through a background check process. Every sponsor must be able to show.
Mr. Secretary, what if they're a foreign national? Are you background checking if they're foreign nationals? Is it possible that MS-13 is bringing their people across the border and taking custody of these children and putting them into trafficking and other unspeakable sort of things? Is that possible?
Remember, I mentioned in my opening testimony that the vast majority, 80, 90% of the kids that we place are placed with the parent.
If you're not doing bioidentical, if you're not identifying these people biometrics, how do you know they're the parents?
So there are many ways to provide or to prove identity. You can look at
So they can prove identity to take custody of children, but not to vote. Is that what you're telling me?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
So you're saying voter ID doesn't need to be required. There's no way to verify somebody's identity. But if they're going to take custody of a child from a foreign country, you're saying they do have an ID or they need to have an ID.
You said voter ID?
Yeah, what I'm saying, in other words, is you require an ID for these people supposedly to take these children, but then you say, many times on the left, they say, well, you know, voter ID is racist or discriminatory. So explain to me, how is it that you're verifying the ID of these people if they don't have IDs and nobody can get IDs?
Thank you for the question. Identity documents are one of the many tools that we use to try to ascertain the relationship of the child with the potential sponsor. But there are many other things that we'll do. If there's a sponsor that has not provided sufficient identification and proven that tie to the child, we can turn to things like fingerprinting if we need to.
So you think this person that got these 20 children is related to all 20 of those kids? Is that what I'm hearing, or?
What I can tell you again is that every sponsor must go through a vetting process in order to be able to sponsor any child.
But if they're a foreign national, we do vet those people as well, or?
Anyone who wishes to apply to sponsor a child must go through the process. If they decline to go through the process, they cannot sponsor.
Well, earlier one of the members mentioned that a certain sponsor had kids delivered to different addresses. How do y'all cross-reference that? How do you justify that?
I'm not familiar with any case that you're referencing, but what I will tell you again is when we
That was
go
the Florida grand jury case, by the way.
when we go through the background checks, we ascertain any number of things, including residence, where the child will be placed. We check on the household members in that place as well, in the home. So we go through the process of not only vetting sponsors, but we also check with those members in the household.
So in the Florida grand jury case where the one child was delivered to the strip club, did y'all vet that location? I mean, was that considered a house? I mean, it's just a strip club now considered a house for children being trafficked or lost?
As I mentioned, Congressman, we can discuss the Florida report. There are many issues that we have with that report.
Let me ask you a real quick question. I'm going to change subjects real quick. And many of the members have mentioned it, the Kayla Hamilton case, where Mr. Martinez, he came across as an unaccompanied child and then ended up killing Ms. Hamilton. How many UACs, unaccompanied children, now do we have in secure facilities? Are you housing in secured facilities? Do you know?
We use secure facilities if we don't believe that we can manage the children or keep the children that they would be around safe, or perhaps even for the safety of the individual. I don't have that number. I can take that back to my team.
Yeah, we'd be curious to know that. I'm kind of trying to figure out how in the world I had this situation in one of my areas where a young lady was raped by a 31-year-old that identified as an unaccompanied child, and he came to this country and then drug a 14-year-old girl into a restroom and raped her, and yet he was identified as a child, and I don't know how you understand, like a 31-year-old, how do you identify that as a child? Is there any test on age when the kids come here? Do you get any documentation on birth certificates, anything like that?
As you're going to many of the documents and the ways that we try to ascertain not just the child's identity, but also get back into the background of anyone who wishes to sponsor.
How does a 31-year-old identify as a child?
Gentleman's time has expired.
Secretary, I want to thank you for your service in Congress. I'm going to let you know, if you don't know it already, I'm a blunt guy, so you're going to have to forgive me in advance. But what's going on here is bad. You know, you talked about mandates. We have a human mandate, a humane mandate, an American mandate. And I hear lots of words. We talk about the bureaucracy and we talk about, all the speeches that everybody's given, and lots of money is the answer to it. And money sometimes helps, no doubt about it. But you have to have the basic rules, the basic foundation to do things right. And just before I go into some questions and ideas here, let's tell the truth. It's tell the truth time. We ease the background checks greatly. Yes, you do very often do background checks, but they're not good enough, and that was done in the rule. We allow those who want to refuse criminal background checks, and some kids are put in those homes and in danger. Having a criminal background is not prohibited. Let's tell the truth. I can read, this committee can read, we all can read, we know what the truth is, and that all sponsors are not vetted. That's the truth. That's what's really happening. Let's deal with the real world. And you've played an integral role in establishing the Unaccompanied Children program foundational rule. The details of the rule, to me, are so abhorrent that it's no wonder some of the worst individuals have been able to exploit it and slip into our country. It's no wonder that hundreds of thousands of unaccompanied alien children have gone missing under this watch. The details of the rule, in my opinion, are insane. We're dealing with kids. We're dealing with children. The rule allows sponsors to refuse background checks. As I said, let me say it again. A sponsor can refuse a background check, and they still can be eligible for taking on a vulnerable child. There's no state adoption agency anywhere in this country, in any state in this country, that would allow this for any foster parent, for any adoptive parent, for any American citizen who wanted to adopt. Why are we not holding sponsors of unaccompanied children to at least the same standard that we hold them? The rule also fails to disqualify individuals with criminal records or child welfare violations from serving as sponsors. How wrong is that? Again, we wouldn't allow an adopted American citizen to do that to an adopted child. Why do we let them? But it gets worse. The rule also actively prevents the sharing of critical immigration-related information with enforcement. You said certain things aren't your job. That's what enforcement is there for. There should be a communication. There should be a dialogue back and forth, especially when sponsors are under investigation for human trafficking or smuggling. You want to know that from the feds. It's evil. It's wrong. I don't know how we justify it. The rule works to undermine age verification processes, and you can read it in the rule. I'm not making it up, which it enables adults posing as children to exploit the system and gain easier access into the United States of America. And even if there is evidence of criminal backgrounds, the rule is designated to create barriers to placing the UACs in secure facilities. This committee has seen the tragic real-world examples of it. Some of it was mentioned by my colleagues. Kayla Hamilton, 20-year-old young woman. She was brutally raped. She was brutally beaten. She was murdered by someone with ties to MS-13 who pretended to be a minor, and nobody stopped it. If we had done our job and put the safety of Americans and the safety of kids over processing illegals quickly, she would still be alive today. And I associate myself with some of the remarks that Congressman Correa said. They're kids. We all love our kids. I know you love your kids. Think about that. This woman's dead. We're not going to bring her back, ever. There's no speech, no bureaucratic action that's going to bring her back. I've seen a lot of stuff, man. I've been in the state senate, the state assembly, county commission, mayor, congressman now for 6 years. Man, I haven't seen too many rules that are worse than this rule, because it deals with kids and it hurts children. It's bad for everyone involved. It's bad for taxpayers. It's bad for American communities. And it's bad, most importantly, for the undocumented children. So I have some questions. I got 23 seconds. Secretary Becerra, I just want a yes or no. Knowing how this rule has worked, do you still believe it was the right answer to the border crisis? Yes or no? Yes or no?
Congressman, the way you've interpreted the rule is not the rule that we passed, so it'd be tough to give you a yes or no.
Well, your interpretation of the rule, do you think it was right?
Well, let me give you a quick example.
I don't need an example. I need a yes or a no. Mr. Secretary, I need a yes or a no. I can always answer questions yes or no. Is the rule good? Is it what you want? Would you continue with it? Yes or no?
Congressman, you said a sponsor can refuse a background check. That's not true. No sponsor who wishes to take a child can refuse a background check.
I read the rule. I had people read the rule a whole lot smarter than me.
That's not the rule we enforce.
I unfortunately have to yield back. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit these questions to the chair.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned, well, the 3 calls that you make to follow up, it could be they just aren't by the phone, or they're at school or at work or something. So, okay, so you make the 3 calls, and you can't contact either the sponsor or the child. So now what?
Congressman, I would pose the question back to you, because
Well, now what? I mean, did you just shrug your shoulders and go on?
No, that's why we have tried to
What
expand.
are you doing then?
Well,
I mean,
that's why
as
we've
Mr. Morris
expanded.
said, if it was my child and I couldn't get a hold of them or the person that's looking after them in 3 separate phone calls, I would be freaking out. Now, you're the surrogate parent in this case. What do you do after the 3 calls go unanswered? You're telling us, you're assuring us, these children aren't lost, but how are you following up after that? Or are you?
Congressman, if you'll give me a chance to respond, because you pose a great question, because you and I, as parents, would want to make sure that we know what's going on with our children. And we make every effort. We don't
3
have,
calls, and then what after that?
Congressman, our responsibility is to provide care while they are in our custody. Under
Mr.
the law,
Secretary, you have dropped them off at a sponsor's house. You now can't get a hold of them. That's on you. What do you do after that? What I'm hearing back is you don't do anything. You shrug your shoulders and then send another batch of kids out to another group of sponsors' homes. That's frightening to me, and it's frightening to everybody who has watched this terrible, terrible situation unfold on your watch. Mr. Van Drew mentioned your Unaccompanied Children Program foundational rule and noted that this was a giant step back from rigorous vetting. Failure to categorically disqualify sponsors with criminal or other child welfare history concerns, instead requiring case managers to first consider a potential sponsor's resources and strengths, never mind that they've got a criminal conviction. Barring the sharing of immigrant information for potential sponsors with law enforcement officials, finding out, are these people trustworthy? And weakening the veracity of age determinations of UACs by requiring forensic evidence that indicates that an adult is posing as a UAC, in your rule's words, should not be used as sole determining factor, but only in concert with other factors, and then shifting the burden of proof so that the ambiguous, debatable, or borderline forensic examination results are resolved in favor of finding the individual is a child. That doesn't sound like a step forward in rigorous vetting. That sounds like a step backwards to me. As mentioned, Senator Grassley's finding, and one particularly disturbing case, that one child was placed with a known affiliate of the dangerous MS-13 gang. Now, according to the documents, HHS disregarded multiple warnings by a case manager about the potential danger of the UAC being placed in this home, this rigorous vetting that you're talking about. You were actually warned by the case manager that you were placing this child with an MS-13 gang member. That doesn't sound like rigorous vetting to me. Since January 20th of 2021, when this administration took office, can you tell me the total number of unaccompanied children that HHS has placed with known or suspected gang members?
was that a question to me?
Yes.
And please repeat the question. I thought you were making a comment.
The question is, how many children have been placed with known MS-13 gang members? We know of one. What do you know?
Congressman, obviously, when we go through the extensive vetting process, we would make sure that what we try to do is place them with someone who will keep them safe. Obviously, someone who is involved in gang activity would not be someone we would consider
And yet you did so anyway after you were warned by the case manager. You've placed, what, 440 UACs with sponsors, 440,000? during your tenure?
We have placed a large number. I don't know if that's the precise number, but a large number.
Well, and again, you assure us that the department undertakes rigorous background reviews of all of these sponsors. So can you tell me how many sponsors have been rejected for failing to pass background checks?
Well, certainly no sponsor who where we flag certain activity, whether it's criminal records, where we flag.
Well, how many have you flagged?
I certainly can try to get back to you with some information on that. I can take that back to my team. I don't have a number with me as we speak.
Do you know how many you've disqualified because of previous murder convictions?
I don't have those kinds of numbers.
How about child abuse convictions?
Certainly none of those individuals, when they go through the vetting process.
What about
will be able to
trafficking in
go
child
through.
pornography? The ranking member reminds me that Mr. Rulli's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hunt of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Biden-Harris Refugee Resettlement Program is not your grandfather's refugee program, and I'm going to tell you why. You grew up thinking that refugees meant the most vulnerable people in the world, but not so much under the Biden-Harris administration. The left can never leave anything alone, and not even the U.S. Refugee Resettlement Program. Biden has reimagined U.S. refugees. You might have missed this, but the Biden-Harris administration in January 2023 created a program called the Welcome Corps. Under the Welcome Corps program, U.S. permanent residents, non-citizens, can recommend and sponsor non-citizens to be U.S. refugees. Yes, you heard that correctly. Non-citizens can sponsor non-citizens to become refugees in my America. Let's make an analogy that the liberal elites will understand. Imagine you are a member of a country club. You pay dues and you enjoy all the benefits that come with being a member of that club. Then one day, you invite a guest to visit the country club, and then the guest invites another non-member to visit the club. And before you know it, the membership is irrelevant. Another member may then ask, how are you inviting people to the club? Are you a member? And the guest will say, no, but I'm a lawful permanent resident. The whole purpose of reimagining the U.S. refugee program is to demean and devalue what it means to become a U.S. citizen. Citizenship matters, borders matter. Having borders is the difference between having a country run by President Trump or by a Haitian warlord barbecue. I am sure that some of you are familiar with the recent Spirit Airlines flight that landed in Haiti and was immediately met with gunfire. And as I said, borders are important. In 2020, under President Trump, close to 12,000 refugees were admitted into the United States. But just this past year, under the Biden administration, the number of admitted refugees has ballooned to over 100,000 people, the highest number in 3 decades. Let me tell you about another Biden-Harris initiative for non-citizens. The Biden-Harris administration has the initiative for refugees called the New Americans Partnership, which is an initiative that fosters collaboration between housing agencies and refugee resettlement agencies to support the housing needs of said New Americans. New Americans? What about the Americans that are already here? Americans are dreamers too. Americans are refugees too. They're refugees of Democrat-run cities. Now, I am sure there are Americans living in Inglewood who would love to move to Beverly Hills. I'm sure there are Americans living in Harlem that would love to move to the Upper East Side. I am sure there are Americans living in the South Side of Chicago who would love to move to Lake Forest. Take a look at the last census. Americans are fleeing Democrat-run states for the haven of Republican states. Why is that? Under the Biden-Harris administration, Americans are left behind while the needs of new Americans are pushed to the front of the line of tax-paying Americans. There's a reason why President Trump won every swing state this year and the first Republican to win the popular vote in 20 years. Americans are sick and tired of being treated like second-class citizens in our own country. President Trump created opportunity zones for Black Americans. President Biden and Democrat mayors created opportunity zones for illegal immigrants. For the left, it's the new Americans first and Americans last. I've said this before, it's not the great replacement theory. This is the definition of the great replacement fact. The left wants to allow millions of people into this country, whether that be legally or illegally, so that United States citizenship means essentially nothing. In this country, we don't have Americans or old Americans or new Americans. We just have my fellow Americans. Now that President Trump is back, I'm happy to say that all American citizens will be treated with respect once again. And with that, I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now claims his own 5 minutes to sum up the concerns I have with all of this checking that you keep assuring us is so rigorous. Your ORR director, Dunn Marcos, told the committee that HHS routinely contacts foreign consulates or embassies in order to verify UAC's documents. Is that correct?
We work with the consulate offices, Mr. Chairman, to try to...
You verify the information of these children with the consulate. When you're doing that, do you ever ask for the child's criminal history? Again, we're talking about adolescents here, and sometimes adults pretending to be adolescents.
As I've said before, Mr. Chairman, we're not a law enforcement agency. We're not an immigration agency.
No, you're a placement agency. You're placing these children in what you keep assuring us are carefully vetted homes, and yet, according to your own ORR director, admitting to this committee in a transcribed interview, that when HHS contacts the consulate to verify information on the UAC, they do not ask for any criminal background information on that UAC. So they don't know if it's a gang member, and they don't ask. Why would she tell us this?
Congressman, we go through a vetting process to ensure that we can know who the child is, and then
yes,
for the placement.
Of course, that's what she testified. But then she also testified that you specifically do not inquire into the criminal background of these individuals who are 17 years old and sometimes older and pretending to be 17, with gang tattoos, with gang affiliations, and you don't, while you've got them on the phone and you are verifying information on that UAC, you don't bother to ask, oh, by the way, is this an MS-13 gang member? Does this individual have a criminal history? And then you place them in foster homes, you release them into our communities, and there are some cases, tragic cases, where they go on to murder innocent Americans like Kayla Hamilton. Mr. Tiffany asked you, is there anything you do differently looking back on these past 4 years? Is there anything you do differently in the Kayla Hamilton case?
Mr. Chairman, we work closely with the Department of Homeland Security, which does the vetting for these children when they first enter into the country.
You're placing them. You're the ones that are placing them in people's homes, and you're the one who's telling me, don't worry about it. They're all carefully vetted. They're all secure. Don't worry that we can't reach them by phone after we've placed them in these homes. It might be they just weren't paying attention to the phone. Do you understand how do you understand how this affects the lives of a population that you've placed that's approaching the size of the state of Wyoming? Some of them innocent, defenseless children, others gang members who are 17 years old or even older pretending to be 17. And you're in charge of all of this. And you can't tell us if there's anything you'd even do differently after 4 years of this nightmare that has unfolded, not only for our country, but for these children and their families. What do you have to say for yourself, Mr. Secretary? This is the end of this administration. It's the end of your tenure. What do you have to say for yourself? Because the words that keep haunting me are those that Cromwell spoke to the long parliament. You have sat here too long for any good you have been doing. It is not fit that you should sit here any longer. You shall now give way to better men. Now depart and go, I say, in the name of God, go. Mr.
Chairman, if you will allow me then to respond. We work closely with various agencies. In the case of the vetting of the child, it is the Department of Homeland Security that does the initial vetting because they're the ones that have custody of that child once the child is in the U.S. The Department of Homeland Security is the agency that then goes through that process of trying to determine who this child is, including those issues that you've mentioned with regard to any past criminal conduct. When we receive the children, Department of Homeland Security shares with us the information they have compiled on that child. From there, what we try to do is make sure we care for the child, and in the process of trying to find them a sponsor where they can live in a community, we go through the vetting of the individual potential sponsor.
Mr. Secretary, when the history of this administration is written, I would not want to be you looking back on what historians say about your tenure. I'm sorry, but that's the fact. If there's no further business to be brought before the subcommittee will stand adjourned.
Representative Van Drew claimed that sponsors of unaccompanied alien children are not properly vetted, and that sponsors can refuse a background check. The Washington Post cited a Senate report that found systematic deficiencies and inadequate vetting of UAC sponsors. Background checks were streamlined due to pressure from the Biden administration. As a result, identity verification and criminal records were not thoroughly examined, while investigation of all adults living in a sponsor's home was suspended.